Hi everyone, I'm Gertie and welcome back to a new month on Patreon. So as you may know, our theme this year is Charm Institute of Style, where every month we're celebrating a different designer or design concept from the 20th century. So I'm very excited that this month we are going to be celebrating knits all month because my new book on knits, Gertie Sews Glam Knits, is coming out next month in May. So we wanted to take a month to really think about the history of knits in fashion design. And this top, the Sphinx top, was named for the legendary designer Madame Grey. She worked with knits a lot, which I think a lot of people don't realize. A lot of her Grecian sculptural dresses were made with silk jersey. And I was really inspired by some of her early work, which was tops with, draped necklines made out of really lovely silk jerseys. So this top is named for her. Her nickname was the Sphinx of Fashion because she was quite a character and she was very reclusive and she was an artist. She considered herself an avant-garde artist. So this is named in honor of Madame Grey. And we'll be talking more about Madame Grey in the Crowdcast this month. So you may have noticed that this top was also inspired by something that may have been more at home in last year's theme, which was Hollywood icons. The black dress that Marilyn Monroe wears in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes when they're boarding the boat, the ship. She wears that black dress with a gold necklace threaded through the neckline. I've always loved it and wanted to recreate it. So it's sort of a happy coincidence that this month we can do a legendary designer and an amazing Hollywood icon at the same time. So this top is an amazing everyday. It can be a separate. I consider it more casual. You guys have been asking for more casual stuff and for separates, so I think this fits the bill. Has this beautiful cross neck. You can do the Marilyn Monroe trick with the necklace. Has a keyhole in the back. We've got 2 sleeve length options. It has a waistline cutting line, so you can either make this as a hip length separate or you can mix and match it with the skirts in my forthcoming book on knits to make a glamorous knit dress. You could also consider using the shorts in the book. You would have to hack it somehow to make it a romper so that you could actually pull it up over your hips, but I'm sure you all can figure that out. So I'm very excited about this top. I hope you love it. We're going to be getting right into talking about pattern pieces and then fabric and supplies. So if you're confused about knit fabrics or how to sew them, this is going to be a great tutorial because I feel like knits are just as simple to sew as wovens, and you don't have to have any fancy equipment. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so now we're ready to look at the pattern pieces for the top, and we've minimized them so that we can look at them together on the tabletop. So the great thing about this top is there are only 3 pieces. It can get a little confusing because you have a separate piece for your right and left sides. So one tip is that you should really mark right and left on the wrong side of the fabric so you don't get confused as you're working. Okay, so another thing to note is that we're going to be working with the F through H cup sizes, which have a bust dart. The A through double D cup sizes do not have a bust dart, okay? So make sure that you're using the cup size piece that corresponds to your size. And let's look at these all laid together. So this is your right front, this is your left front. The way these are going to go together is that the right, this extension folds over the left side. Okay, and this gets seamed up center front until this small circle. And you've got a lot of marks on this pattern piece. I'm not going to take you through every single one right now, but know that they're all important. And some of them are larger circles, some are smaller circles, and I'll be talking you through them as we sew. But it's really important that you notch everything, every mark, that you transfer those circles to the wrong side of your fabric. Okay, and just so you know, this fold line here, this gets turned under, and this is going to be gathered here, which is how we create that draped effect. We have a couple circles that match up in ways that you might not expect, like this large circle here matches this one here. This gets gathered. This small circle matches here. This notch is going to match your shoulder seam, and then kind of like a shawl collar, this extension here wraps around to the back. And then this on the right side is where you apply your button loops, okay? So if you get confused, just remember the right side always goes over the left. It's just like with a women's button-up shirt. the right side goes on top. Okay, so just remember it that way. We've got a couple other things to note here. Sleeve cutting line. I love the short sleeve on this, so I'm going to be making a lot of those. That's your short sleeve cutting line. It includes the hem allowance. We've got notches for the side seams. And then this waist cutting line, this is where you would cut it to tape it to one of the skirts from Gertie Sew's Glam Knits. Okay, so you do not need to take away or add a seam allowance there. We've already taken that into account, so you would just tape those lines together. And then on the back, so, okay, you're gonna cut one of each of these fronts, right? And then on the back, you're gonna cut two. So a few things to note, this shape right here, that's the keyhole opening in the back. You've got notches here, nothing quite as complicated on the front, but again, take note of those cutting lines. Okay, so that's it, just 3 pattern pieces. And next we're gonna be talking about fabric and supplies. Let's talk about fabric and supplies. So when it comes to knit patterns, I feel like we get a lot of questions about what type of fabric to use. You do have to use a knit. This top would not be suitable for a woven, but there are lots of great knits, very affordable knits that you can use to make this top. So when you get my book, you will see that we did all of our testing and sewed a lot of the sample in a knit that's called ITY. And that's the dress that I'm wearing. It's a very smooth, drapey knit. It has around 70% stretch widthwise and very little stretch lengthwise. So that's what we're calling for fabrics in the book. You're looking for 50 to 70% stretch widthwise, and then very little to minimal stretch vertically. Okay, so let's talk about how you figure out stretch percentage. So you want to have a ruler ready to go, and then you're going to grab a fabric, a swatch like this, or just, grab some of the yardage. Make sure that you're pulling it exactly in the direction of greatest stretch, which is probably perpendicular to the selvage. You're going to take 4 inches of it, like this, and then see how far you can stretch it. So if you can stretch it 6 inches, that's 50% stretch, okay? Because 2 inches is half of 4 inches. So that would be 50%. So this one goes about to 6.5 here. And so you want no greater than 7, all right? And 7 is pushing it a little, so you may need to size down. Okay, so in the lengthwise direction, you can see this it has less stretch, and that's great. So let's talk about what to do if you have a fabric that you love, you want to use it for this top, but it has more or less stretch in either direction than what we're recommending. It's totally possible. There are so many varieties of knits that sometimes it's hard to get exactly what a pattern is calling for. So if the pattern has more widthwise stretch than we call for, then you'll want to size down, okay? If it has less stretch, you'll need to size up. So keep in mind too that lengthwise stretch will affect the fit of your garment, especially if you're making a dress. Because once you attach a skirt, the lengthwise stretch can cause it to kind of droop down, and then your waistline will be too low. So if you're using something with more lengthwise stretch than we call for, keep in mind you may need to make the bodice shorter by taking a length adjustment across the midriff, okay? So you can work with other fabrics, just keep in mind you might have to make adjustments. So let's talk about the fabrics that I have laid out here. This is a matte jersey. It's very similar to ITY. It has a really beautiful drape. It reminds me of silk jersey, so that's why I wanted to use ITY or a matte jersey for this top, because it's very much the texture and drape of something like Madame Grey would have used. So matte jersey, ITY, that's great. We use the ITY from Fabric Wholesale Direct, very affordable, has a lot of colors. You could also use something like a rib knit. This is a lovely leopard rib knit from Blue Moon Fabrics. We use this for the Sophia dress. This would be a great choice for this top too. You could also use something like a cotton jersey. So again, you're just going to want to check your stretch percentage for all of these. Cotton jerseys tend to have a little less stretch, but this would still almost work. So we're not quite to 6. So this is a great example of something that you may either need to size down entirely, or you may need to just take in the side seams if it's not too much of a difference. I love this fabric. This is called Pointel with these little dots here that form a pattern. This would be a great choice for this top. Gives it a little bit of a sweater knit feel. And this lovely fabric is a cashmere sweater knit, which is so beautiful and soft. So if you really want to splurge and make something luxurious, cashmere sweater knit would be a great choice as well. So those are a few fabrics. As always, we have our full list of recommendations in the instructions. You're also going to need all-purpose polyester thread. Metrocene works great for knits. And then you'll want a stretch needle, okay? We keep on hand stretch and jersey needles in all the sizes. You may have to test out and see if you're skipping stitches. That means that you are not using the right needle. So you may need to experiment a little bit, but stretch needles should work for this fabric. If you're making a dress, you will want to have some 1/4 inch clear elastic on hand, because you'll want to stabilize the waistline so that it doesn't bag and stretch over time. So keep that in mind if you're making the dress version. Otherwise, this is all you need. It's pretty minimal. Okay, we forgot to put them on the table, but you also need buttons. So the size is not super important. You can use ball buttons, you could use a flat button. But the important thing is that we're going to be making little rouleau loops. I'm going to show you how to do it. So you have to make them the correct size for your buttons, and you need 2 of them. It's a nice touch if you want to do a covered button, so cover in your fabric. That looks really great. You could also use elastic cording to make the loops instead of fabric. So we're going to talk more about that in the next chapter when we get started sewing. All right, we're ready to get sewing. I did want to show you on the red dress what the back is going to look like. I feel like it's going to be a little bit easier to explain. So you can see we made our own rouleau loops on the right side back. So this is just self fabric made into little loops. And then on the left side, we have our lovely self-covered buttons here. So for my top, which I'm going to be making in this pretty sky blue ITY, I've already created this little strip tube. So normally, like in a woven fabric, we would make this out of bias cut, right? But in a knit, you can make it on the straight grain. Knit doesn't really have a grain, but you can cut it parallel or perpendicular to the selvage. And then you could cut like a 2-inch strip and then sew it at a 1/4 inch with the fold to the right of your machine, which will help it, right of your needle, which will help it keep it consistent in its width. So you could do a 1/4 inch, or if your fabric's a little thicker, I would do 3/8. And then turn it right side out, trim down the seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch, and then turn it right side out with a loop turner. So then the next thing we're going to do is we are going to find our button loop placement marks on the right front bodice, which looks like this. And then we're going to create those little loops like this. Okay. And this needs to go on the right side. So there's my first loop. And for the moment, I'm just guesstimating the size. I'm just showing you how it's going to be placed. Okay, remember you have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance there, so you got to take that into account. And you want this to be oriented right over, so the center where the 2 loops meet should be right over your circle. You can also make these with elastic, what's the right word? Elastic, you know, elastic tubing that you buy that coordinates with your fabric. But it looks really nice to make it out of the same fabric as your top. Sorry guys, words, thoughts not coming. So I'm going to be using the same size button, so I'm just going to like double check, and this is a little big, so I'm going to make it smaller. So you should be pulling out your buttons right now. It's really like the worst thing in the world when, well, it's not the worst. It's one of the, it's up there when your loop is too small for your buttons, because then you really struggle to get in and out of your top. I'm gonna make it even a little smaller. So, and also kind of think about how you want the loop to lay. Like that is good. So I'm gonna be at 5/8 of an inch, and this fabric stretches obviously, so it might be a little smaller than you think it needs to be. That's great. Okay, I feel good. So there's one. This is very fiddly, obviously. And now I'm going to make a second. This is my other little circle here. I'm going to make a second that's the same exact size as the first. Okay, got it. So the most important thing is that you're using your own buttons, whatever size they may be, size, shape, etc., and making sure that they're going to fit comfortably around. The loops are going to fit comfortably around the buttons. Okay, so these look about the same size to me now, so I'm going to baste these on at 5/8 of an inch. A long stitch length, just a straight stitch is fine here. We're going to be using zigzags for the rest of the top, but this doesn't need to stretch. I'm not too worried about it. So as you're basting these on, what you want to do is make sure that the loops don't have a gap where they meet, okay? So just kind of as you're stitching, just make sure that they stay together. And there we go. Okay, so I basted these to the right side so that when we get flipped here, they're gonna look like that. And I'm just gonna test these around this size button real quick. Voila, I'm happy with that. They could maybe be a little bit smaller, but I'm not too worried about it. And I think they look nice. So trim away any basting. There we go. All right, so that's your first step. We're ready to move on to the next. Okay, so our next step is to sew our bust darts if you have them. So this would be for the F through H cups. If you're sewing the A through D cups, A through double D, excuse me, you can skip to the next scene. Okay, so we're gonna do this on both sides of the bodice. This is the right as worn, left as worn. You can see I have in faint yellow here, the bust darts marked in. And I'm just folding them in half just like we always do. Putting a pin at the end, and now I'm going to, oh, I did it perfectly the first time. So I like to kind of guesstimate where the lines will be on top of each other, top to bottom, then put my pin through, and I didn't do it perfect the second time. And the goal is to get those lines exactly on top of each other. There we go. And if they're not on top of each other, you just shift the layers a little. Okay, so now we're ready to sew this one. I'm going to use my regular straight stitch for this. I just like how it looks better on darts, and then once we start doing the seams in the next chapter, then we will switch to a narrow zigzag. If you're worried about them popping, though, you know, darts don't get a ton of stretch, like side seams do, for instance, you can just stretch slightly as you sew. So I backstitched at the beginning, and at the end, at the point here, I'm just gradually fading off here. I'm going to leave a couple inches of thread, more like 4 inches, and tie in a double knot. There we go. Okay, so knits really don't require a ton of pressing like wovens do. I still just like to be in the habit of pressing mine. I just think it gives you a nicer finish, and you know, it's good to stay in that habit. Okay, so I'm pressing the darts down, pressing the point flat. And that's what it'll look like from the right side. So I'm going to repeat that on the left front, and then we will come back for our next step, which is sewing the center front seam. As you can see, my bust darts are sewn, and now we're going to sew this center front seam. So let's put these right sides together, and we're going to pin these together only up to your circle. And then it starts to go into this extension for that beautiful draped neckline. So I have my circles marked in yellow here. I'm going to get them right on top of each other. There we go. I'm going to put a double pin here just to remind myself not to keep stitching. And now you can fill in pins in between. You may notice that we're missing our little buddy here today, our big orange cat named Buddy, who has starred prominently in the last couple of videos because he's moved into my house and he's doing great. I do miss having him here to do videos, though, to be honest. It got a little unwieldy at the end because I was always like having to stop and put him on the floor. Not to mention the yowling in the background. So he's in the house now. He's so happy. Everyone is getting along, so good news all around. Okay, so let's take this to the machine. And finally, I'm going to do a zigzag. So for seams, I put my zigzag width at 2.5 and length at 2.5. And we'll do something slightly narrower for hems, just because it's a little bit prettier. But for now, 2.5 by 2.5 will be great for seams. And of course, if you have a stretch stitch on your machine that you prefer, by all means, feel free to use that. Some people like to use a serger on knits, though I really like to use my sewing machine pretty much exclusively, which I think is one of the biggest misconceptions about knits, is that you need a serger, and I find I don't need one at all. So part of the point of this book was to really get people to see that you really just need the equipment you have on hand to sew knit fabric the vintage way. Okay, there we go. Now I'm going to clip to this circle as far as you can without cutting through your stitching. And now we will press this open. And one of my favorite chapters in the book to write was the book about the history of knits in vintage fashion and in vintage sewing. Because we may think of it as a relatively new thing, you know, with like athleisure and t-shirts and stuff like that. But the truth is, you know, it goes all the way back to, you know, the 20s and Coco Chanel using wool jersey. And then of course you have people like Madame Gray, who this top is inspired by, who used a ton of silk jersey. Some of my favorites, Jean Shelley, who sewed with sweater knits, just encrusted in sequins and beads. And then of course, oops, I dripped a little water. We have our knits in the home sewing community, which has been a really interesting history with people having to learn how to sew these fabrics. Okay, Oops, got a little something there. All right, so next we're gonna move on to the top back. So grab your 2 back pieces and meet me back here. Okay, this is our top backs, right and left. So we're gonna put these right sides together and sew from the keyhole down to the hem. Now, so there are no like chalk markings or, dart markings or anything like that on the backs. So you may have trouble telling your right side from your wrong side. And with a lot of knits, they can look really similar. So I would just say be really careful here, because you might be tempted to just say, oh, it doesn't matter. But with this ITY, there's a definite difference. The right side looks a little smoother, has a little more sheen than the wrong side. So just be careful. All right, so we're starting at the bottom of the keyhole, which is that like teardrop shape here. Ouch. Oh, okay. Again, using our zigzag stitch from the keyhole down to the hem. Now we can press this open. So anyway, one of my favorite pieces of research for that chapter of the book was knits in home sewing and how did that develop. So I remembered I had read Nancy Ziemann's memoir several years ago, because her publisher sent it to me back when I was a more full-time blogger. And I remembered her writing about double knits and how they were like, because she used to be the manager at a sewing or a fabric store. That was kind of how she got her start. And she talked about just like bins and bins of double knits and how people went crazy for them, but like didn't really know what to do with them or how to sew them. And so then you saw the rise of companies like Quick Sew, and new machines that had stretch stitches. So it's really interesting how it evolved from being something like wool jersey that you could just sew on a regular sewing machine to this sort of industry. Okay, so there is our top back. So in the next scene, I'm going to come back and we're going to do the keyhole binding. Okay, so now we are ready to bind the keyhole. And you're going to need a strip of your fabric, so it should be 1.5 inches by the length specified in the instructions. You can also just kind of roughly measure the keyhole at 5/8 of an inch. I'll give yourself like maybe a little bit extra too, and then we'll just trim away whatever we don't need. So in the instructions it says a bias strip. With a knit you can really cut it whichever way you want. I cut mine going with the direction of greatest stretch, and that'll be fine. But if you have maybe a sturdier knit, in which case maybe you sized up to get the top to fit you, that's totally fine. In that case, maybe you want to figure out if the bias is going to be a little stretchier or give you a little more give. Basically, you're looking for what's going to, curve around this keyhole the best, right? Because that's a really curvy keyhole. I'm going to find the right side of my strip. And we're just going to start pinning. I actually, with like tight curves like this, I don't love to pin the whole thing first. I find it easier to just get started and then kind of place my fabric as we go around the curve because it's such a tight curve. Okay, so I'm just going to place a couple pins and now we're going to head to the machine. Can't really, because we're gonna be stitching in the ditch. You can't really stitch in the ditch with a zigzag. So we're gonna go to a straight stitch and we're gonna be stitching at 5/8 of an inch. So just stitching this strip right sides together with the keyhole. And see how it's easier to just kind of place the raw edges together as I stitch, because I can also now, we want to make sure this center back seam, the seam allowances are opened up. Now we can kind of like manipulate the keyhole, like straighten it out so it's easier to sew. So I'm kind of getting a straight line here, making sure I don't have any little folds. You can also kind of stop regularly, reposition as needed. And you don't want to really be pulling this, but it's okay if you hold them kind of taut together. Okay, so you can see I have a little extra strip here, which I'm going to trim off. First, I'm going to make sure I didn't get any little tucks or folds in here, and that looks good. Okay, let's go over the cutting table. All right, so I'm going to trim away any excess. And now what I'm going to do is, with the strip flipped down, I'm going to trim these seam allowances to a scant 1/4 inch. Whatever that means to you. I would say the most important thing is that you're consistent here. And you'll see why in just a second. Okay, so I'm trimming both of these seam allowances down as one. Take your time with this. Feels a little fiddly. Go. Okay, so seam allowances trimmed down to a 1/4 inch. And now we are going to take the bias strip, flip it up, and then in. Okay, so you want your finished width here to be about a 1/4 inch. And this is why we wanted consistency with our trimming. And now I'm going to pin. And you're going to have a little excess here. We're going to trim that away in the next step. So don't worry about it for now. For now, you're just focused on getting a nice, consistent, roughly 1/4 inch width here. And pinning in place. All right, so now we are pinned in place and we're going to stitch in the ditch right here. I'm going to use my number 10 foot. This is an edge stitch foot. My thread really doesn't match my fabric. So, which is partially because I want it to be a little contrasty for you all. So to make sure that I'm really hiding the stitches in the ditch, an edge stitch foot is nice because it has this center blade here. So I'm going to align the blade with the ditch. And that means I don't have to like follow my needle's movement. I'm just watching the blade here. And making sure that it's gliding along in the ditch. Oh wow, I'm not doing a very good job. Is this scent? Jeez. Okay, well, apparently I'm edge stitching this. Wow. I'm going to be consistent and continue to edge stitch. You know, I think it's because this ITY, to make excuses for myself, I think it's because this ITY moves around a lot. So if I'm aiming for the ditch, I'm actually getting slightly to the right of it. At least I'm doing it consistently to the right of it. Oh my God. Well, that's my stitch in the ditch, everyone. Beautifully hidden. I'm just kidding. This is the worst stitch in the ditch I've ever done. We're gonna call it an edge stitch at this point. Wow, I'm so sad for myself, but not sad enough to go rip stitches out of ITY when I'm trying to get a video done. Okay, so now I'm going to trim this really close. Don't use an edge stitch foot. That's my tip for you now. That was terrible. Yeah, you're gonna have to just watch the needle go up and down and try to get it right in the ditch. So my new advice is to go really slowly and just keep an eye on the needle. And just try to get it in the ditch as much as possible. Use a thread that matches. Wow, I got a little thread nest on the back. Complete failure. Utter devastating failure. All right, I trimmed the strip really close to the stitching, and because it's a knit, it won't fray. All right, so if you're having trouble stitching in the ditch, like some people, what you can do is be intentional about it and make this an edge stitch. All right, so it really doesn't look terrible. It's just really not what I set out to do. So hopefully I haven't lost all credibility in this video. That would be a real shame. It's like, you know, just decades-long career down the drain. One little edge stitch. It's not that bad, right? You guys aren't gonna judge me. Okay, so whether you edge stitched or stitched in the ditch, you now have a finished keyhole, which is going to look lovely. Now we're ready to assemble the top, so the shoulder seams and the side seams. So what we're gonna do is take our top back and then our top front, which looks like this, right? It has kind of like octopus arms going everywhere. We are going to put these right sides together. And these steps are very easy, so I'm just going to talk you through it briefly. This is your shoulder seam. You have a notch to match there. Like so. And then we're going to pin the side seams and the underarm seam on the sleeve. So this is a cut on sleeve as opposed to a set in sleeve. So that means it's cut in one with the bodice. So we're gonna sew it in one with the bodice. I love how this cut on sleeve looks in this style. So the inspiration for that was Marilyn Monroe's outfit in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, that black dress with the gold necklace threaded through the crossover neckline. I always loved how the cut on sleeve means that you don't have another seam right next to the crossover. It just kind of gives you a smoother look there, and it helps like not detract from the visual interest of the crossover in my mind. Plus it's just a super vintage look. I also love how this top looks with the short sleeve length. So I really want to make it in some sweater knits with short sleeves for spring. I think that will be so cute. Okay, so let's do one of these together. We'll do the underarm. How about that? And here you're going to want to go to a narrow zigzag 2.5 by 2.5. And that is so that our seams will be stretchy, which we definitely want on these side seams. This is where the top gets a lot of movement. So you want it to move with your body. I don't want to pop any stitches. So I'm stitching at 5/8 of an inch here. Okay, now the underarm curve, there's a couple tricky areas here. I mean, not tricky, you guys can handle it, but you've got your dart. You want to make sure that that stays pressed down. And with knits, that can be a little tricky because it gets kind of like smushed up under the presser foot sometimes. So just be careful with that. And then here we have a sort of tight underarm curve. And now we're just finishing off the sleeve. Okay, so there's one underarm sewn, and all of these seams should be pressed open. I just wanted to note that at the underarm, you're going to want to do a few little clips into the seam allowances so that you're able to press open here. So I'm going to press my seams open. I'm going to do this shoulder seam, and then I'm going to repeat on the other side, and then we'll come back and get a cup of tea or something, or a Coke Zero, or whatever your beverage of choice is that is going to fortify you, because next we're going to be dealing with the cross neck, which is not impossible, but it does require you to be sharp. Okay, so we'll be back in a minute. Okay, so here's where we get into the tricky part. So I have my laptop on the table with me, and I recommend that you keep the instructions close to you. There's a handy diagram. It all is going to make sense, but just know that we're going to be kind of like crossing things over here and stitching things to the neckline edges. So a little note about the instructions. These pieces here are called the collar in the instructions. Not really a collar, but just to distinguish what this piece is. And then you'll see things referring to the neckline edge. The neckline edge is from the shoulder seam to the circle here. It's straight on the right side. And then on the left side, the neckline edge is curved, and again goes from the shoulder seam to this little indentation here. Okay, so that's your neckline here. It's shaped like a neckline. All right, one side straight, the other side is curved. Okay, so we're going to be using those terms as we sew this. The first thing you need to do, we're going to be working on the right side first as worn, okay? So the first thing you need to do is find your large circle, which is right here. So we are going to clip diagonally to the large circle, okay? So this is a little scary. You're going to clip diagonally to that large circle there, okay? Like so. And now we are going to cross our two collar pieces, remember? We're going to cross the right over the left. And now what we're going to be doing is we're going to take the left side, which is the underneath piece, and we're going to be sewing it right sides together with the neckline edge. Okay, so there are a few things to match here. I'm going to start with my center back. So there's a circle at this back corner that's going to match your finished keyhole edge at center back. Then we are going to take this notch and it matches your shoulder seam. So I'm going to make sure my seam allowances are stayed pressed open. And then finally, we are going to find the circle on the collar and match it to the circle we just clipped to. And match those together. Okay. Like so. And now we can fill in pins in between. Okay, so just to review, we crossed the right over the left, and then we focused on the left, pinning it to the top, to the neckline edge. And now we're gonna stitch. Actually, I wanna turn this over just to make sure that we stay stitching where we're supposed to, because you wanna start exactly on that circle that we clipped to, and then we're gonna stitch to the center back, to the keyhole. So let's use a narrow zigzag here because we're sewing a seam. So I'm starting right on the circle and then back stitching. And now I'm just going to finish off stitching. So I'm coming up to the shoulder seam here. Okay, and because I match my circles here, that means I'm going to have 5/8 of an inch overhang after the finished keyhole, which is perfect. Okay, so now you should be seeing that your collar is stitched to your neckline edge on the right side, and we still have the right collar hanging out over here. Okay, so in the instructions, it says you're going to trim down the seam allowance that you just stitched and then press it towards the collar. So I'm going to wait until I do the other side just because this step still makes me nervous. So there's no reason you can't just do that after we do the other side. So I'm going to break the chapter here just in case you need to refer back, which if it were me, I would need to. So we just did the right side. In the next chapter, we'll come back and do the left side. All right, so we're coming back to sew the left neckline as worn. Okay, so we have our right collar crossed over the left side of the top. And now we're going to take this long edge, the one that extends from center front to center back, and we have a circle at center back. We're going to take this, we're going to flip it down so it's right sides together with the left neckline, and that's the one that curves. Now I find it easiest to start at center back at the finished keyhole. I'm going to pin that right sides together with that right collar. And now I'm just going to keep moving to my next match point. I have a notch here which matches the shoulder seam. Pins there. And after the shoulder seam, our next match point is this notch, which also has a large open circle, okay? And that's it. So we're going to match that to the other notch. We're going to fill in pins in between. So what's a little confusing here is that there's going to be a little section here. So what can be confusing is there's a little section here. There's that little indentation on the right, I'm sorry, on the left neckline, the curved one. From there to the notch, you're not sewing. You're starting to sew at the notch where the large circle is. You're going to continue to the shoulder seam, and then you're going to finish up at the center back seam where the keyhole is. Okay, so let's stitch that little portion. All right, so starting stitching out that circle, again using my zigzag. And when you get to center back, it's just like the other side. You have 5/8 of an inch hanging over the finished keyhole edge. There we go. Trim any threads. Okay, so there's my center back keyhole. There are my little loops. Now let's look around to the front. It should look like this. Now I'm going to note, you're going to see that there is, from center front to this little section here that we just sewed, there's an unfinished seam allowance. That's going to feel weird, but what's going to happen is it's going to flip under. And I was skeptical, so if you're skeptical, I understand. I was like, that's not going to stay under there. We're going to need to stitch that. But it stays, and it would be a real shame to have a line of stitching there. So it's a sort of minimalist, less is more finish here because we don't want to have a line of stitching right there. Okay, so there it is. Both neckline sides are done. You can trim these down, press them towards the collar. And next we're going to move on to finishing the center back and creating some gathers there. The next thing we're going to be focusing on is gathering. So I want to just show you the red dress again to give you some context for what we're doing. So this is what it looks like finished at the center back. We're creating these gathers right here. And then there's a cut-on facing that folds in that doesn't have gathers, okay? And so the gathers are what help create the draping at the center front when it's worn, okay? So that's what we're gonna do next, is we're gonna be creating gathers right here at center back. So let's start with the side with the button loops. So you're gonna be gathering between the circles, and the circles start at the fold line, and the next circle is where it joins at center back at the keyhole, okay? So we're just gonna be gathering this little section right here underneath the button loops. So switch to a straight stitch here. You don't wanna gather with a zigzag, that's weird. You wanna gather with a straight stitch, and you wanna use a length between 4 and 5 millimeters. Make sure you have a couple inches of thread here, and then our first line of gathering stitches is going to be at 1/2 an inch. Here we go. I'm going to go until I get to that bound keyhole right there. Just a short little section here. And then another line of gathering stitches at 1/2 an inch. No, I'm sorry, at 1/4 inch. Oh my goodness. first one's at 1/2 inch, second one is at 1/4 inch. Okay, so there's 2 rows of gathering stitches underneath the button loops, and these are going to get pulled up from the bobbin side like so. Just roughly pull them up for now, okay? They need to match this side. We're going to be sandwiching the button loops in there. But first, let's gather the other side, okay? So find your other center back, the collar, and this one does not have button loops, but it has the button markings. And we're going to do our gathering stitches from the bound keyhole, my shameful bound keyhole, to the fold line where the circle is. Oops. Oh, my thread rack just fell. It's so peaceful in here without Buddy. Like I miss the chaos a little bit. But don't worry. The chaos is happening in the house. Eli and Buddy really just started playing together like last night. It was so cute. And this afternoon, Eli comes just like tearing up the stairs. All right, now I'm going to gather this. Tearing up the stairs, Buddy is following. And it turns out, so I have this, there's this catnip mouse. It's called Shelby, the long-tailed mouse or something like that. It's all, you know, it's like hemp mouse. It's all organic, hippy-dippy stuff. But my cats love these Shelby mouses. And there's a version that has like a really long tail. Like it's probably like 3 feet long. It's just like twine or something, but they love it. But anyway, Eli comes tearing up the stairs with Shelby's tail wrapped fully around him and like harnessed under his arm. And Buddy is playing with the mouse attached to Eli. It was amazing. I love cats. Okay, so now we have our 2 back sections gathered. And in the next step, we're going to be sewing that center back seam. Okay, so now we're going to be sewing that center back neckline edge. So again, let's start on the side with the button loops. So we're going to be folding this right sides together, and you should have a marked fold line there. So the button loops are getting sandwiched in between these 2 layers. And you also have another line here at your 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. That should match your collar seam line here. And then if you need to pull up your gathers further to get these 2 pieces to match, now is the time. Oops. Don't pull them out. Okay, so now you can see my fold line is at the top here. The 5/8 of an inch line is matching the collar seam line here where it joins the keyhole. And we're just going to leave this seam allowance free for now. So we're going to stitch from the fold at the top down to 5/8 right here. Okay, so down to that next line. Using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And actually I'm going to switch to a zigzag here, because we want this to have some stretch and flexibility here. You know, bust your top when you're doing your buttons. Okay, and now I'm finishing at this lower, I'm finishing 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. So I'm leaving the seam allowance hanging there, like so. Okay, this guy is just hanging. And now we can trim down these seam allowances, get rid of the bulk of those button loops, clip into the corner. And now this can get turned right side out. Look at that, gathers plus button loops. Okay, so now we're going to repeat that on the other side. This side without the button loops. So we're going to fold in half, right sides together. I'm going to pin right here. This lower line matches the collar seam line. Raw edges match here. I think I need to pull my gathers up a little bit more. Distribute them evenly, and there we go. So now we're going to sew this side. Again, we've got that seam allowance hanging out. We're going to trim down the gathered seam allowances here just to reduce any bulk. Then we're going to turn it right side out. Look how beautiful. We got a nice finished corner there. And now, hopefully we can see what our center back is going to look like. So beautiful. And the buttons will go on this side to correspond with the loops. All right, so now we're going to talk about a little finishing work. We're so close to being done. I know that was tricky, but it's really a fast sew, which is nice. Okay, so I've turned this wrong side out. We're now at our center back with the button loops, and we just need to do a little hand finishing here. So one thing I recommend is that you trim away these neckline seam allowances there, and you are going to turn in the collar seam allowances and pin to get a nice clean finish here. And this needs to be slip stitched. So you're going to stitch here. I would slip stitch to where you stitched essentially. Your zigzag stitching will be your guide here on this side. So to about right there, you're just going to slip stitch that in place. And then on the other side, same idea. All right, we're just going to turn in, and on this side, turn in your seam allowances. You can really just stitch to the shoulder seam here. If you want to go a little further, that's fine, but you're just turning in those seam allowances. Again, you might want to clip away some bulk at the keyhole, but just getting a nice clean finish like that. Okay, so you're going to slip stitch both those sections, and then of course we are going to put our buttons on. So you're going to use your button loops as your guide after you slip stitch to place two buttons, one here, on this underlap side, on the right side as worn, okay? And then that will be finished. And then the next and final thing to do is to do your hems, your sleeve hems and the lower hem. I do just want to talk a little bit, so I'll take you through the hem on the bottom of the garment. So you're going to turn in your seam allowance 5/8 of an inch. Press all the way around. My iron's still heating up a little, so I'm going to give her a minute. And these little seam gauges are very handy for when you're measuring something that needs to be consistent all the way around. Ah! So dramatic, okay. So this is for the hip length top, obviously. If you're making this as a dress, which I love this as a bodice for a dress, as I mentioned in the earlier scenes, you would be chopping the pattern piece off at the waistline seam and taping. No, that's not right. You wouldn't be taping it together. You would be sewing it together at the waistline with the skirt of your choice, and then hemming the skirt rather than hemming the top. It's really nice to have this as a separate piece though. It looks so good with like a circle skirt or a Stanwick skirt, whatever your heart's desire may be. But it goes with a lot of our woven charm separates really nicely. Maybe some Lucille trousers. Oh, that would look so good. So good. I just have one more section here. Pressed and pinned all the way around. And this would be the same process for the sleeve hems, by the way. Now we're going to go to the machine and we are going to top stitch. Now for hems, I like to do a narrower zigzag because it just looks a little nicer. So 1.5 wide by 2.5 long is perfect. And we're going to do this at 1/2 inch. So that will just be catching your raw edge on the inside. Like so. And we're catching that turned up hem allowance on the inside. Now, if you like, and you're experienced with this, another thing you could do here is use a twin needle. And that looks really nice. It looks like 2 rows of straight top stitching, but it's stretchy. So on the back, it'll be a zigzag. On the front, it's 2 rows of straight stitching. So it kind of is, it looks like a cover stitch, if you've ever seen a cover stitch machine. So I did write about twin needles a little bit in the book. So that would be a great option for hemming this. But, you know, when it comes to knits, I'm more of a like less is more person. So a narrow zigzag I think looks just fine. And if you're someone who's really experienced with knits, or maybe you sew activewear or something like that, you may have a cover stitch machine. In which case, bust it out for this hem. Okay, so you can see our hem here. It may look a little wavy, and I would recommend giving a little steam. And now it looks nice and flat. This is why sometimes with knits you do need to press, because that is a much nicer finish. Okay, so that is it. I know that might have been confusing at times, but hopefully you love the results. I think this top is so pretty and so versatile. Okay, so thank you all for watching. Okay, that is it, your Sphinx top. Thank you so much for sewing along with me today. I hope you've loved this process of sewing knits. I hope you learned that it's not as intimidating as you might have thought. And I hope that you're really excited for my new book. I hope that you'll pre-order it. That always really helps the initial sales numbers. So if you do want to give it a pre-order, I would really appreciate that. So I can't wait to see what you make with your Sphinx top. Don't forget to tag me, #Sphinx top, and tag me in your posts on Instagram because I really want to see what you're making. All right, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.